A single envelope that looked harmless on the outside, but inside, it carried the kind of message that could shake a person's entire life at 82 years old. By sunset, an elderly couple who had lived peacefully in their home for 50 years would be told something they never thought they would hear in America. Your home is no longer in compliance. You may have to leave. And the person behind it all was someone they had never even argued with before. A new HOA president, Karen Whitmore. Robert Miller was 82 years old. His wife, Margaret, was 80. They were not wealthy people, not influential, not loud. They were the kind of couple who kept to themselves, greeted neighbors with a small wave, and spent most evenings sitting quietly on their front porch. That house was not just property to them. It was memory. 50 years ago, Robert had carried Margaret through that same front door as a newly married man, nervous and hopeful. They raised their children in those rooms. They celebrated birthdays in the kitchen. They even grieved losses inside those walls. Every corner of that house had a story attached to it. And over time, the house became less of a structure and more of a life they had built together. But quiet neighborhoods don't stay quiet forever. A change came when the HOA board elected a new president, Karen Whitmore. She was not new to rules, but she was new to compromise. And in her first few months, residents began noticing a shift. Warning letters increased. Inspections became stricter. Small things suddenly became violations. Mailboxes were too old. Paint colors were outdated. Porch structures were non-standard. At first, most people ignored it. They assumed it was routine enforcement. But then the tone changed, and the letters stopped feeling like reminders and started feeling like pressure. One Tuesday morning, Margaret went to the mailbox like she always did. But the moment she saw the thick envelope, something inside her already felt uneasy. She carried it back inside slowly. Robert noticed her expression immediately. "Is it another notice?" he asked calmly. Margaret didn't answer right away. Her hands were slightly shaking as she opened it. Inside was multiple pages. HOA violations listed line by line. And at the bottom, a financial penalty that was larger than anything they had ever received before. Margaret sat down slowly. "This can't be right," she whispered. Robert took the paper, reading it carefully. He stayed quiet for a long moment. Not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. "These aren't suggestions," he finally said. "These are demands." 2 days later, Karen Whitmore showed up in person. She didn't knock politely. She stood at the edge of the walkway holding a clipboard, as if she had done this many times before. And slowly, neighbors began noticing and watching from their windows. Robert stepped outside. Margaret followed behind him. Karen didn't introduce herself. She didn't smile. She simply looked at the house and said, "This property is not in compliance with HOA standards." Robert responded calmly, "This is our home. We've lived here 50 years." Karen flipped a page on her clipboard. "That does not exempt you from regulations." Margaret's voice softened. "We are not refusing to maintain it. We just can't afford all of this at once." For a brief second, there was silence. Then Karen replied coldly, "Then you should consider whether you can afford to stay here at all." That sentence hit harder than any fine. Margaret went quiet. Robert's expression tightened slightly, but he still didn't raise his voice. Across the street, a neighbor had already taken out a phone. Recording. Karen noticed. She didn't react. Instead, she added one final line. "If compliance is not met within the deadline, further action will be taken regarding occupancy." And just like that, she turned and walked away. No explanation. No empathy. Only silence left behind. Margaret looked at Robert, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Are they trying to take our home?" Robert didn't answer immediately, because even he didn't want to believe what it was starting to look like. And what neither of them realized yet was, this was no longer just about violations. It was about control. And the next step Karen took would turn a quiet neighborhood into a place no one could ignore anymore. By the next morning, the situation in the neighborhood had changed completely. What started as a simple HOA violation notice was no longer about paint, porches, or property rules. It had become something much bigger. Because now, people were watching. And what they saw made them question everything about the new HOA leadership. Especially Karen Whitmore. Robert and Margaret Miller spent a sleepless night. Not because of the fine itself, but because of what it meant. The idea that after 50 years in the same home, someone could suddenly decide they didn't belong anymore. Margaret sat at the kitchen table early in the morning, holding the same notice again and again. "This is our home," she said quietly. "How can they even talk like this?" Robert didn't answer immediately. He was thinking, not emotionally, but carefully, because something about the wording in that letter didn't feel random anymore. It felt structured, intentional, like it wasn't just enforcement. It was pressure designed to force a reaction. Outside, the neighborhood was no longer quiet. People were talking. Whispers moved from house to house. And by afternoon, several residents had already seen the video that had been recorded during Karen's visit. The clip wasn't long, but it was enough. An elderly couple, a calm but firm confrontation, and a statement that left most viewers uncomfortable. "If you can't comply, maybe you shouldn't live here." By evening, the video had spread through local community groups. Comments started appearing. Some were supportive of HOA rules, but many were not. "Those people are 80+ years old. This feels wrong. This is not what HOAs are supposed to do." And slowly, something shifted. Karen Whitmore, however, did not slow down. Instead of easing pressure, another notice arrived at Robert and Margaret's home. Final compliance deadline: 7 days, or escalation would follow. Margaret read it once, then placed it down. "I don't understand what they want from us," she said. Robert finally stood up, and this time, his silence felt different. Not confused, not scared, but aware. Because Robert had spent part of his life working in administrative housing documentation decades ago, before retirement, before this quiet life. And he recognized patterns. This wasn't standard enforcement language. This was escalation language. That evening, something unexpected happened. One of the neighbors, an older man who had lived across the street for 20 years, knocked on their door. He looked uncomfortable, but determined. "I saw the video," he said, "and I just want you to know you're not alone in this." Then another neighbor came, and then another. By nightfall, Robert and Margaret's living room had more visitors than it had seen in years. People weren't there to gossip. They were there because something about the situation didn't feel right anymore. One woman spoke softly. "She's doing this to all of us, just not this aggressively yet." That sentence changed the atmosphere, because it stopped being about one couple and started becoming about a pattern. The next morning, something unexpected happened again. A formal complaint was filed, not by Robert or Margaret, but by multiple residents, questioning HOA conduct, financial enforcement practices, and selective targeting of elderly homeowners. The tone in the neighborhood shifted again, and this time, Karen noticed. At first, she responded by doubling down on enforcement notices. But something she didn't anticipate was beginning to form. Resistance. Not loud, not chaotic, but organized. And in the middle of all of it, Robert quietly placed the HOA letter on the kitchen table again. Margaret looked at him. "What are we going to do?" Robert finally spoke after a long pause. "We're going to let this play out properly. Not anger, not panic, just certainty. Because now, this was no longer just about their home. It was about whether a system designed to protect neighborhoods could be used to push people out of them. And Karen Whitmore had just made one mistake she didn't realize yet. She had chosen the wrong elderly couple. A week later, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. For the first time, Karen Whitmore wasn't the one asking questions. She was the one answering them. One by one, residents stood up and shared their experiences. Several homeowners brought copies of warning letters they had received. Others showed videos and records of conversations that painted a troubling picture of selective enforcement. Robert and Margaret sat quietly in the back of the room. They weren't looking for revenge. They just wanted to keep their home. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, the board reached a decision. All fines issued against Robert and Margaret were immediately canceled. The board also launched a formal review of Karen's actions as HOA president. The room fell silent when the final vote was announced. Karen was removed from her position. For the first time in months, Margaret felt the weight lift from her shoulders. Tears filled her eyes as she squeezed Robert's hand. Their home was safe. A few days later, neighbors gathered outside the couple's house. Some brought food. Others brought flowers. Many simply came to show support. Standing on the same porch where they had once feared losing everything, Robert looked across the crowd and smiled. After 50 years in that home, he had learned something important. A house is made of wood and brick, but a home is protected by the people who stand beside you when it matters most. And that day, Robert and Margaret knew they weren't standing alone.